The black night gave me black eyes, but I used my nostrils to seek out the light. Lu Zhenhan said. Lu Zhenhan felt as if his nose was shattered. He slowly opened his eyes, but quickly closed them again. The soreness in his nose sent a sharp pain through his entire eye area, making every part of his body ache. After regaining his senses, Lu Zhenhan gradually felt his body replenishing its strength, finally shaking off the feeling of exhaustion. Enduring the agonizing pain all over his body, Lu Zhenhan rolled over and sat up, his injuries throbbing against the scorching sand. It was indeed sand. Lu Zhenhan could tell from the sensation coming from his fingertips. As strength slowly accumulated throughout his body, Lu Zhenhan opened his eyes once again. A brownish crab, with its enormous claws, passed by indifferently in front of his eyes. Its beady eyes glanced at Lu Zhenhan, seemingly filled with disdain, while muttering a bunch of white foam. It left a faint trace on the sandy ground before burrowing into the gravel. Lu Zhenhan felt furious. That crab seemed to regard him as nothing more than a coconut. This blatant disregard completely ignited his anger. He reached out and pulled the little creature out of the gravel with a few swift motions, tearing it apart and stuffing it into his mouth, chewing furiously. The crab tasted quite good, with a faint saltiness. Chewing on the crab's pincers, Lu Zhenhan tried to stand up. The surroundings were unfamiliar. A golden beach stretched as far as the eye could see, with an endless ocean and ebbing tides lapping at his ankles. Far away on the sandy beach, plants resembling palm trees grew. The wind, like a gentle lover's kiss, carried the scent of the sea. A crab pincer silently slipped out of Lu Zhenhan's mouth, leaving him gaping like an aroused hippopotamus. Where am I? Wasn't I on the battlefield in southern Xinjiang? Bullets, yes, the sounds of guns. Wasn't I shot? Fragments of memories flashed through Lu Zhenhan's mind like a montage. He lowered his head and looked at his body. There wasn't a piece of clothing to be found. His entire body had turned slightly pale from being soaked in seawater, except for one foot still wearing a sock. The gray polyester sock had been soaked in seawater, giving it a peculiar color. Lu Zhenhan ran his hands over his body, relieved to find that his body, which he remembered being riddled with bullets, was intact. He fiercely plucked a handful of chest hair, the sting confirming that this wasn't a dream. Where am I? Lu Zhenhan couldn't comprehend it at all. The sting in his nose brought him back to reality. Although his actions just now weren't significant, his nose had started bleeding again. Lu Zhenhan felt liquid flowing on his lips, and immediately a familiar, all too familiar, salty and bloody taste filled his mouth. Lu Zhenhan felt as if his nose had turned into an uncontrollable faucet. He didn't have time to worry about cleanliness. Lu Zhenhan quickly took off the sock from his foot and tightly pressed it against his nose. This couldn't go on like this. Lu Zhenhan turned around in place, stumbling for a moment, and began to observe his surroundings. It was a small island, desolate in appearance. Even the sensation of the wind blowing against his body felt primitive. The sandy beach he stood on was the only downward slope on this small island. Not far from the beach was a huge fish skeleton, resembling a whale. The skeleton had been bleached white from exposure to the sun. With a considerable amount of seaweed hanging on the part submerged in water, Lu Zhenhan looked down at the beach beneath his feet, where colorful clams were stranded on the sandy shore soaked in blue seawater. Lu Zhenhan's stomach audibly growled. He had already discarded the crab in a days earlier. His knowledge as a seasoned reconnaissance soldier told him that eating too many of these clams, including the tide raisers like the crab from before, would certainly cause diarrhea. In this desolate and barren island with no supply or support, any illness would pose a lethal threat, but he was too hungry. After a battle between reason and reality, Lu Zhenhan unhesitatingly chose reality. These colorful clams indeed tasted delicious. Although he was eating them raw, it didn't affect their natural freshness and smooth flavor. Combined with the faint saltiness of the seawater, it was even more appetizing. Lu Zhenhan ate more than 10 of them in a row, feeling a surge of strength filling his body. Despite being a reconnaissance soldier with exceptional self-control, Lu Zhenhan couldn't muster the courage to even glance at the clams anymore. He was afraid that his hunger would overpower his rationality. Regardless, his top priority was to survive on this deserted island. With a firm determination, Lu Zhenhan stumbled towards the skeleton lying on the beach. The skeleton was intact and massive, making Lu Zhenhan suddenly feel incredibly small, carefully feeling the glossy skeleton that exuded a rock-like shine. Lu Zhenhan noticed a broken rib on a row of ribs. The broken end was sharp and about 1.5 meters long, while the other intact ribs were around 2 meters. Lu Zhenhan instantly set his sights on this particular rib. He was currently very weak. And who knows what kind of wild beasts roamed this deserted island. This rib with a broken end served as a natural spear, perfect for self-defense. Although Lu Zhenhan was known for his strength on the battlefield, he was currently as weak as a newborn baby. He didn't have the confidence to be picky or choosy. He searched the beach 3 times, but there were many stones, and unfortunately, Lu Zhenhan could hardly lift most of them. After searching for a while, he finally found a fist-sized rock that he could manage to lift. Albeit with some effort. He vigorously struck the rock against the skeleton countless times, until Lu Zhenhan was almost exhausted. Finally, he managed to break off the rib into a makeshift spear. Due to exerting too much force, Lu Zhenhan lost his balance and fell forward, his whole body diving into the skeleton. The sharp end of the rib accidentally tore a gash on his bare abdomen, startling him. With an unexpected burst of strength, Lu Zhenhan forced himself out of the skeleton. Lu Zhenhan lay on the beach for a while to catch his breath before standing up unsteadily. Looking at the cut below his belly button, he took a sharp breath, sat back on the sand, and carefully inspected the wound. Fortunately, it didn't hit any vital organs. And the bleeding wasn't severe. He glanced up and noticed a sparse strand of black curly hair hanging from the broken end of the skeleton. Lu Zhenhan patted his chest, praising the gods and Buddhas involuntarily, even though he had never been superstitious. The situation was still dire. The injury on his nose made him feel dizzy, and compared to that, the injury on his abdomen seemed inconsequential. Lu Zhenhan realized his lips were parched, so he licked them, only to discover a split. His throat was also dry and irritated. Picking up the bone spear, Lu Zhenhan suppressed the impulse to sharpen it with a stone. Although the curvature of the rib resembled a katana, Lu Zhenhan knew he didn't have the strength to work on it any longer. For now, he decided to use the bone spear as a makeshift cane. Slowly, Lu Zhenhan made his way up the high slope. Before long, the tide had started to rise on the beach. The water, which had initially only reached his ankles, now reached up to his neck. Lu Zhenhan felt lucky that he hadn't drowned when he appeared in this desolate place. On top of the high slope, there was a tangled mixture of thorns and red willows. The island was quite large, with several rolling mounds and a mix of tall coconut and palm trees scattered among the low red willows. It still appeared desolate and barren no matter how far one looked. Lu Zhenhan huffed and puffed, stumbling his way to the nearest coconut tree. He searched around for some stones, intending to knock down a coconut. After several attempts, the feeble stones failed to reach the coconuts but managed to hit Lu Zhenhan's head instead, nearly knocking the wind out of him. Am I still Lu Zhenhan, the man known as the human rocket launcher on the battlefield? Lu Zhenhan grimaced as he rubbed his sore shoulders and head. He looked up at the coconut tree that seemed to mock him in the air. The dryness in his mouth intensified, making him even more thirsty. Do I have to stand here like an idiot and watch these coconuts on the tree? Am I just as useless as the female soldiers I used to communicate with, all show and no action? Lu Zhenhan grew angry with a mind full of mischief. His eyes rolled around, and Lu Zhenhan came up with another idea. He found a vine from the bushes and carefully took off his sock from his nose. Lu Zhenhan's rare gentleness was revealed at this moment. He felt like a groom helping the bride remove her armor. The sock was stuck to his blood, and as he tore it off, Lu Zhenhan grimaced once again. Fortunately, the bleeding had stopped. Lu Zhenhan gently touched his nose, feeling like his nostrils had expanded tenfold. Oh no, I've ruined my face. Lu Zhenhan almost cried, although he regretted the loss of his handsome appearance. He didn't have much time to dwell on it. He put the blood-stained sock on the vine, tied it up on both ends, and placed the selected stones inside. He swung the homemade sling in the air, making a whooshing sound. At first, it was a bit challenging, but after a few rounds, he gained momentum, and the swinging became faster. Whoosh! With Lu Zhenhan's determination, the stone shot out, hitting the towering coconut tree with a loud thud. Two coconuts embraced each other and fell to the ground, bouncing twice before coming to a stop. Thank heavens! Lu Zhenhan choked up. He realized that Elder Ging's strict discipline in the past really made sense. Without his strict guidance back then, how could he control the accuracy of the sling in such a weakened state and achieve a double shot? The coconut tasted delicious, although a lot of its sweet juice had spilled when he hit it with the stone. Nonetheless, Lu Zhenhan was satisfied. Sometimes, it's difficult for people to be content, but at other times, it's surprisingly easy. Lu Zhenhan thought to himself. He couldn't help but envy those with protruding front teeth. If he had a set of big buck teeth, he felt he could save himself a lot of trouble while enjoying the coconut meat. The taste of the coconut flesh was slightly reminiscent of water chestnuts, pleasantly sweet. Lu Zhenhan couldn't help but feel envious of those people with buck teeth. If he had a pair of protruding front teeth, he believed that eating the coconut meat would be much easier. After gnawing off the coconuts until only a thin layer of skin remained, Lu Zhenhan felt a surge of energy throughout his body. He picked up the sling and shot down the remaining coconuts from the tree, stringing them together with the tree vine. I won't be separated from coconuts even when I sleep from now on, Lu Zhenhan vowed. Although there were only a few coconut shells left after finishing them, Lu Zhenhan didn't waste them. He threaded them together with the tree vine to make a simple loincloth. Even though the island didn't appear to have any inhabitants, Lu Zhenhan still felt uncomfortable wandering around naked. Although the loincloth was crude, it at least covered his essentials, and Lu Zhenhan felt a bit more at ease, almost subconsciously. He wanted to scratch his groin, but instead, his hand landed on one of the coconut shells. Lu Zhenhan chuckled foolishly, thinking that this amateur hobby of his might be forcibly changed. He put the extra coconut shell on his head, resembling a helmet. Damn it, I must look like a stupid Japanese soldier. Lu Zhenhan burst into laughter again, pushing aside the dense shrubs. Lu Zhenhan set his sights on a nearby mound. He temporarily used the bone spear in his hand as a machete. The twilight glow had started to appear in the clouds, and Lu Zhenhan felt it necessary to find a place to settle down first. Who knew what this place held? After passing through the thicket, there was a forest of red willows. Lu Zhenhan's appearance startled a group of seabirds inside, causing them to fly into the sky in a flurry. Lu Zhenhan was also taken aback by this spectacular sight and almost dropped the coconuts on his back. Under the short red willow trees lay a thick layer of bird droppings and feathers. Lu Zhenhan tested it with his foot, finding it quite soft. He pondered whether he should walk over or take a detour. Just then, a small creature resembling a squirrel landed on his shoulder. The small creature had long ears, a chubby face, golden silky fur, a bulging belly, and two large, swirling eyes. Lu Zhenhan looked at it in astonishment, and it returned his gaze. It held a wild fruit in its front paws and brought it closer to him. Lu Zhenhan shook his head. Refusing its kind gesture, Lu Zhenhan examined the small creature. It seemed fearless, which amused him. Seeing that it had almost no meat on its bones, Lu Zhenhan couldn't summon any dirty thoughts. He gently lifted its fluffy tail, lifted it off his shoulder, and placed it on the ground. "Let's go, little one." Lu Zhenhan stuck out his tongue and patted its head, making a silly face. Gwugwa, the little creature, let out a comfortable purr, imitating Lu Zhenhan and making the exact same silly face. Its pink tongue also stretched out. So adorable. Lu Zhenhan pinched its small cheeks, feeling a wave of joy in the palm of his hand. Finally, Lu Zhenhan felt much better after feeling down for a while. Looking at himself, he realized he had nothing impressive to offer and chuckled apologetically. "Let's go back home quickly." Lu Zhenhan patted the little creature's head once more, stood up, and walked towards the forest of red willows. Lu Zhenhan noticed many low red willow trees with bird nests. He made up his mind that dirt on the ground wouldn't matter. He would go for it. After all, he wasn't in a beauty contest. The bird nests must surely have eggs. And it wouldn't be bad to grab a few for dinner in the coming days. In the bird nests of the red willow forest, there were many bird eggs and newly hatched chicks. Lu Zhenhan picked up more than a dozen eggs, filling his helmet to the brim. But he didn't disturb the recently hatched chicks. The seagulls circling in the sky screeched, whether praising Lu Zhenhan's conscience or cursing him as cruel, he couldn't tell. Lu Zhenhan turned around and was surprised to find that the little creature was still following him, with a small wooden stick in its hand. It had impaled a wild fruit it had just eaten on the stick and was carrying it on its shoulder, standing straight and looking at him. Lu Zhenhan dumbfoundedly stared at it for a while. The coconut balanced on the stick on his shoulder clattered and fell to the ground, splattering bird droppings everywhere. It's imitating me? Lu Zhenhan's scalp felt like it was about to explode. The little creature, with its big belly and straight posture, walked over, its long tail and golden fur covered in patches of black and white bird droppings. It had the stick on its shoulder, with a wild berry impaled on it, looking like a proud general welcoming a victory. No way? Lu Zhenhan felt his tonsils facing the air and quickly closed his mouth. This little thing was clearly laughing, with its eyes squinting and an air of smugness. Lu Zhenhan felt that this laughter was filled with wisdom, far from being just an ordinary animal. He recalled the anecdotes his mother used to tell him about animals being spiritually connected. Back then, he was still a child and didn't believe what his mother said at all. But later, when the production team slaughtered a cow, his mother took him to see it. The cow being slaughtered had tears rolling down its eyes. At that time, his shock could only be compared to today. Lu Zhenhan bent down, beckoned with his hand, and the little creature immediately threw away the stick on its shoulder. It crawled and jumped from Lu Zhenhan's arm into his embrace, pressing its small head tightly against him. Lu Zhenhan felt a deep sense of satisfaction, squeezing the little creature and constantly caressing its head. The little creature also seemed to enjoy it, with its two rabbit-like ears standing tall, making contented purring sounds like a spoiled cat. After a brief affectionate moment, Lu Zhenhan continued on his way with the little creature that resembled neither a squirrel nor a rabbit. He felt that he could no longer be separated from this little thing. It was as agile as a squirrel, with excellent jumping ability. Occasionally, it would dart into the bushes at the roadside and come back with some berries or other things, proudly presenting them to Lu Zhenhan. Although he didn't dare to eat those berries, Lu Zhenhan felt deeply satisfied. The only exception was when the little creature brought him a large, fat worm. It was like a giant silkworm, with a plump, white, semi-transparent body. Lu Zhenhan almost vomited at the sight of it, but luckily he didn't have much in his stomach, and his powerful digestion had already taken care of a lot. He dry-heaved, expelling a pile of clear water. "Damn it, you scared the hell out of me." Lu Zhenhan twisted his face and swung his palm in the air, but then stopped. He couldn't bring himself to hit it. The little creature became even more audacious, climbing onto Lu Zhenhan's head and straddling it. Lu Zhenhan suddenly felt like he was wearing a large fur hat. The little creature was covered in bird droppings, but after thinking it over, Lu Zhenhan couldn't come up with a reason not to let it stay there. Serendipity. This is serendipity. Lu Zhenhan pondered. At last, he had arrived at his destination. The journey wasn't overly long, but Lu Zhenhan felt utterly worn out, as if his body was on the verge of collapsing. The mound before him stood approximately 5 to 6 meters tall. Lu Zhenhan circled around it and only then discovered a lush coconut grove behind the mound. This discovery left him frustrated. Lu Zhenhan unloaded all his belongings and took a good look at the surrounding environment. The spot he had chosen was quite favorable, sheltered from the wind with adequate lighting. The sound of the tides resembled celestial music, and Lu Zhenhan finally found some relaxation for his body and mind. The only thing that puzzled him was the lack of vegetation on the mound. It was mostly covered in a layer of greenish-brown moss. He dug his hand into the mound, giving it a twist, and underneath the moss, a bluish-gray rock surface revealed itself. Lu Zhenhan passionately kissed his socks over and over again. Today, these socks had proven themselves to be incredibly versatile. They had served as an improvised first aid kit, a slingshot, and now transformed into a fire-starting tool. Back then, he had considered using the fabric of the socks to make underwear due to its scarcity. But now, if he had used them as underwear, it would have been like using an anti-aircraft gun to shoot mosquitoes, underutilizing their true potential. Guagua. Lu Zhenhan fondly rubbed the little creature's head and said, "The heavens have been kind to me, giving me you and a pair of socks." Whenever the small creature's head was rubbed, it would make murmuring sounds resembling guagua. That's why Lu Zhenhan named it Guagua. Curious, Guagua hopped over when it saw Lu Zhenhan affectionately kissing the socks. It reached out and held the socks in its furry little head, leaning in close. It imitated Lu Zhenhan and kissed the socks as well. Curiosity could kill a cat. This pair of socks, which originated from one of the smelliest feet on the southern frontier battlefield, completely captivated Guagua. The moment the small creature caught a whiff of the sock's scent, its agile little eyes froze, It wobbled for a moment, and then collapsed to the ground as if drunk, its chubby belly heaving up and down while panting heavily. In the middle of the night, he was awakened by the cold. The bonfire had dwindled to a cluster of sparks, and the firewood was nearly burned out. Cold winds swept whoosh over the earth and mound. Despite the bed being sheltered from the wind at the foot of the hill, it was still freezing. Lu Zhenhan glanced at Guogua, who was curled up in his arms, and lovingly patted her little head. The small creature's big ears twitched, she smacked her lips, rolled over, and exposed her round belly. Lu Zhenhan grabbed the sock and covered the exposed belly of the little creature. He gently stroked its head. Under the chilly starlight, the blood-stained sock and Guogua's shiny golden fur inexplicably tugged at Lu Zhenhan's heart, quietly getting up. He went to the nearby thatched grass and collected some twigs and dry thorns. He returned and rekindled the bonfire. What a cursed place! How nice it would be to have a cigarette. Lu Zhenhan sat in front of the fire, feeling a tinge of nostalgia. Regardless of what happened tomorrow, his first priority would be to find some salt and build a rudimentary shelter. Without salt, he felt as if his head was heavy and his steps were light, in a dazed and sluggish state. Guogua's round little eyes looked at Lu Zhenhan, seemingly filled with envy. It made several futile attempts but realized that swallowing the bird egg was practically impossible for it. Thus, it gave up. Lu Zhenhan belched after consuming 5 or 6 bird eggs and couldn't help but burst into laughter upon seeing Guogua's expression. He playfully threw 2 bird eggs into his mouth together and chewed loudly. Guogua darted onto Lu Zhenhan's face, extending its pink tongue to lick the yolk that had smeared on his cheek. It affectionately rubbed its small head against Lu Zhenhan's stiff beard. Ha ha! Lu Zhenhan felt a deep sense of satisfaction. His laughter abruptly ceased as a magnificent blue-eyed wolf silently appeared from behind a mound of dirt. It stared intently at Lu Zhenhan, its phosphorescent eyes flickering across the bonfire. Lu Zhenhan's pupils constricted in an instant, and a wave of coldness washed over him, causing his body temperature to plummet to freezing levels. He didn't have time to consider why the wolf was entirely blue. Almost instinctively, Lu Zhenhan grabbed the whalebone spear beside him and hurled it. Besides hand-to-hand combat, he had also participated in knife-throwing competitions during army training. In his first battle on the southern frontier, he had disarmed an enemy with a close-range throw of his military knife. Lu Zhenhan was confident in his skills. Even though he hadn't fully recovered his strength, the sharpness and quality of the whalebone spear below his navel were proof enough. But something unimaginable happened. The blue-eyed wolf opened its mouth, and from its exposed fangs came a visible gust of wind, spinning like a tornado. This rapidly rotating airflow formed a crescent-shaped blade that flashed and vanished in an instant. With a resounding clang, Lu Zhenhan watched in disbelief as his only means of self-defense, the whalebone spear, was visibly sliced apart, scattering bone fragments that fluttered and fell, some even landing in the bonfire, causing a crackling sound. The spear fell to the ground, rolling to a stop in front of Lu Zhenhan. Deeply etched onto the spear was a mark, as if it had been slashed with a military knife. Lu Zhenhan knew the quality of the whalebone spear, and he was well aware that a strike from his usual trench knife would have produced a similar result, but the terror was far from over. The blade-like airflow formed by the inward spiraling air remained powerful, pressing down the flames in the bonfire by half an inch. With a hair's breadth of difference, it grazed past the right side of Lu Zhenhan's cheek. Lu Zhenhan turned his head in disbelief and saw a swath of grass flatten behind him, while a few dogtail grass tassels floated in the air. What is this? Lu Zhenhan was dumbfounded, unable to comprehend what was happening. The majestic wolf let out a contemptuous snort, as if it disdained Lu Zhenhan's feeble attempts. Its gaze resembled that of a hawk surveying the land. Lu Zhenhan felt that the wolf was far from the listless creatures he had seen at the zoo. There was a glimmer of intelligence in its eyes, almost giving him the illusion that he was facing a person, not a wolf. The wolf's air of arrogance sent a shiver down Lu Zhenhan's spine. Despite his shock, Lu Zhenhan immediately grabbed Guogua from his arms and placed it behind him. He picked up a piece of firewood from the bonfire and stood up. Lu Zhenhan didn't know if the wolf was afraid of fire, as all his conventional knowledge had been muddled by the wolf's blade-like airflow. If the wolf could produce such an air current, resembling the strike of a bayonet, then it was not surprising if it wasn't afraid of fire either. Although the blade-like airflow was formidable, it was no different from a bayonet charge. In our military tradition, a bayonet sees blood within 30 meters. Lu Zhenhan crouched down, holding the crackling firewood in his hand, pointing it at the blue-eyed giant wolf. When the wolf attacked, he aimed to strike its nose right into its rear end. Abyssal. What the hell is going on? A massive crimson dragon suddenly burst forth from Lu Zhenhan's chest, with its head coiling around his neck. Its claws were almost dripping with drops of blood, having pierced through the skin. This was the tattoo Lu Zhenhan got during his military service, a symbol of the renowned Red Crimson Dragon Battalion that dominated the battlefield. The tattoo was made of cinnabar mixed with pigeon blood. An invisible tattoo that only appeared when his blood was surging. Lu Zhenhan was clearly ready to risk his life. He stared fixedly at the giant wolf, slowly shifting his body. The space for maneuvering here was too small, and the wolf's wind blade was too dominant. Lu Zhenhan didn't want to engage in a fight that might accidentally harm Guogua. The wolf watched with interest as Lu Zhenhan moved. Its blood-red tongue kept licking its nose, and its blue fur stood on end like steel needles. It seemed curious and ready to test the prey before it. Lu Zhenhan felt a weight on his head and glanced upward. Guogua had climbed onto his head, its little paws tightly gripping his hair. Guogua, come down quickly. Lu Zhenhan was anxious, in that distracted moment. The giant wolf made its move. The bonfire had no effect on it whatsoever. With a leap, the blue-eyed wolf was only 5 steps away from Lu Zhenhan, resembling a young calf. Lu Zhenhan's torch slipped from his hand and smashed directly toward the wolf's nose. The giant wolf snorted disdainfully, and a gust of wind blade shot out, meeting the torch head-on. With a crisp sound, the torch burst into a dazzling display of fireworks, scattering sparks in the glow of the setting sun. The wolf's face was splattered with the sparks. And just as it was about to fly into a rage and tear apart the creature that dared to challenge its dignity, Lu Zhenhan, propelled by a powerful force, appeared in the wolf's line of sight. Leading the charge was his massive fist, aimed directly at the wolf's nose. A crack resounded, and Lu Zhenhan's fist landed solidly on the bridge of the wolf's nose. Before the wolf could react, a sharp pain shot through its abdomen as Lu Zhenhan's knee collided with its belly. Lu Zhenhan threw a right punch, followed by a left, both striking the partially open maw of the giant wolf. He wasn't going to give the beast another chance to unleash that damn wind blade. It was just like avoiding bullets. Lu Zhenhan wasn't foolish. He was the embodiment of the military's killing machine. Renowned for his technique, the black tiger pierces the heart, The wolf whimpered under the assault, hastily retreating. Lu Zhenhan's body went limp, wanting to pursue, but his stamina was depleted, and he simply didn't have the strength. Helplessly, he watched as the wolf backed away. He gasped for breath, then remembered about Guogua. Fortunately, the weight on his head was still there, and the little claws continued to grip his hair, causing a tingling sensation. Stepping on the ground, the bone spear returned to Lu Zhenhan's hand. He had given his all with 2 punches and a kick, yet failed to kill the wolf. Opportunities for another surprise attack were now extremely limited, and at this point, Lu Zhenhan had no choice but to stand his ground. Blood flowed from his nose again, but Lu Zhenhan didn't dare wipe it. The wolf before him had surpassed the boundaries of human imagination. He desperately longed for a machine gun or even a Type 56 automatic rifle. The giant wolf stared at Lu Zhenhan, who stared right back. They locked eyes like 2 fighting roosters. The wolf opened its mouth, and instinctively, Lu Zhenhan swung the bone spear, but it struck nothing. Turning his gaze back to the wolf, he noticed a trail of blood running from the corner of its mouth, and a sharp tooth had fallen to the ground. Damn it, those 2 punches were still somewhat effective. Lu Zhenhan muttered, feeling a renewed sense of confidence. The wolf fixed its malevolent gaze on Lu Zhenhan, slowly retreating. Though its hind leg was slightly hobbled, its body remained steady and oppressive. Lu Zhenhan's heart sank abruptly. Oh no, this beast clearly possesses a different kind of intelligence. It knows how to play to its strengths and avoid its weaknesses. Lu Zhenhan felt a wave of unease. He didn't know what he would do if the wolf continued to unleash those wind blades while standing there. Sure enough, the giant wolf halted at a distance of 20 paces. Its wide mouth opened, and another wind blade came flying towards Lu Zhenhan. He swung the bone spear to block it, then performed a roll on the ground. With a light touch, the bone spear was reduced to a mere fragment. What kind of power is this? Is it going berserk? Lu Zhenhan looked at the bone dagger in his hand and couldn't help but wryly smile. Before he could think any further, the wolf had already pounced. Without hesitation, Lu Zhenhan smashed the bone dagger in his hand toward it. The wind blade collided with the bone dagger, and this time the wind blade's power was significantly diminished, falling to the ground along with the dagger, enveloped in dust. The wolf was exceptionally cunning. The wind blade was not its killing move. Its entire body also lunged forward, taking advantage of the moderate distance to execute a pounce right after the sprint, which was its ultimate secret technique that I in midair. The wolf's bared fangs were revealed, and its phosphorescent eyes had already transformed into a sinister blood red. Within its wide-open mouth, amidst the bluish hue, the position right in the center of its canine teeth had a fresh breakage, showcasing a raw and jagged edge. Its claws also emitted a faint blue glow. This pounce was as swift as lightning, sealing off all of Lu Zhenhan's retreat paths. How could one escape from a wolf? How could one withstand such earth-shattering pounce? He thought of his brother. He thought of his mother. Although he had already experienced a brush with death once before, Lu Zhenhan's eyes welled up with tears. Beast, taste the might of your grandpa. Amidst Lu Zhenhan's crazed shouts, he yanked the freshly made underwear from under his crotch. Even though he knew it was highly unlikely, he still had to give it a try. He wanted to strangle this peculiar and unreasonable wolf with the tree vine. Lu Zhenhan had never been the type to resign himself to destruction. A gust of wind whooshed past Lu Zhenhan's forehead. He felt a tearing, icy cold sensation on his forehead, and then he saw a faint white energy mass hurtling straight towards the wide-open mouth of the giant blue wolf. drooling with viscous saliva, the leaping wolf, midair, clearly didn't anticipate this. It was too late to dodge, so it instinctively tilted its head, allowing the energy mass to collide with its left cheek. Ahu! A mournful wolf howl echoed as the entire body of the giant wolf plummeted from the sky, landing in front of Lu Zhenhan. He was astonished to see that on the previously ferocious and terrifying face of the wolf, there was now a crystalline ice edge slowly but steadily spreading. The once hardened blue fur on the wolf's body quickly became enveloped in a layer of frost. The wolf's face clearly displayed an indescribable agony, and its front paws clutched the spot where it had been struck by the energy mass. Its entire body convulsed as if experiencing electric shocks. Lu Zhenhan dumbfoundedly stared at the fallen giant wolf before him. He was completely shaken. The wolf's front paws couldn't entirely cover the eye that had been hit by the energy mass. Lu Zhenhan could clearly see that the once arrogant and domineering wolf eye had become completely chaotic. It resembled a swirling, creamy color within the eyeball, compared to the other eye that still emitted a chilling gleam. This eye reminded him of the canned pineapple he used to eat during his time on the front lines, soaked for a long time in preservatives. Translucent and strange, the giant wolf continued to tremble, its convulsions growing more intense. Its limbs, and eventually even its tail, started twitching uncontrollably. Lu Zhenhan paused briefly, but he didn't have time to think any further. He quickly looped the underwear he was holding tightly around the wolf's neck. As he threaded the vine between the wolf's claws and neck, his calf trembled involuntarily. Although he couldn't comprehend why this giant wolf suddenly seemed to have contracted malaria or lost its combat abilities, Lu Zhenhan felt a sense of panic deep within his heart. The blue giant wolf's body was massive, and its sturdy neck hinted at its brutal strength. The more Lu Zhenhan observed, the more anxious he became. He forced his vision away from the wolf's body, away from its enormous head resembling that of a young calf. Lu Zhenhan planted one foot firmly on the broad back of the giant wolf and tightly wound the vine around his hand, giving it a firm tug. He felt an intense bone-chilling coldness beneath his foot, as if he were stepping on dry ice. And a pricking sensation on the soles of his feet. The wolf, restrained by the vine around its neck, suddenly unleashed an immense burst of strength, despite being on the verge of death. Its front paws desperately clawed at the ground, carving deep grooves as its sharp claws plowed through the earth. Lu Zhenhan almost had the illusion that he wasn't wrestling with a wolf, but rather, he was pulling against a revving combine tractor in the opposite direction. Lu Zhenhan, unable to withstand the force, decided to sit squarely on the ice-cold spine of the giant wolf. He firmly planted both feet on the ground, leaning backward with all his might. At that moment, Guogua, who was perched on his head, also jumped down and stood on the broad back of the giant wolf. Mimicking Lu Zhenhan, the chubby little creature tightly grasped the vine, its plump buttocks sticking up high as its adorable little face turned bright red in an instant. Son of a, Lu Zhenhan felt like he was steering an uncontrollable boat, battered by raging waves. The body of the giant wolf thrashed desperately on the ground, and several times, Lu Zhenhan almost lost his balance. Gradually, the amplitude of the wolf's thrashing decreased, but every inch it moved left deep claw marks, as if plowing the ground with its 5 sharp claws. The massive wolf inched its way forward, step by step, getting closer to the mound. Its claws gripped the mountainside, attempting to stand upright. With each extension of its claws, it scraped off patches of moss from the mound, which slid down repeatedly. The soil layer of the mound was scratched away, revealing the underlying rocky terrain. Each time the wolf extended its claws, it scattered grayish-blue stone fragments as it scratched the rocky surface. Its head, held high by the taut vine, expelled foamy breaths from its enormous jaws, releasing a strong, foul odor. The foam landed on the surface of the mound. Lu Zhenhan, upon seeing the foam, knew that success was within reach. He exerted even more force. Feeling as though he had exhausted every ounce of strength he had ever possessed, just as they were on the verge of strangling the wolf, the vine unexpectedly snapped with a sharp crack. Lu Zhenhan and Guogua both tumbled backward, rolling far away. Lu Zhenhan narrowly avoided falling into the bonfire, but he could smell the singed scent as his hair got burned. Guogua landed in his arms, and he tightly gripped its long ears. Even though the flames on Guogua's hair couldn't be extinguished in time, it quickly executed a graceful carp struggling move. It grabbed the half-spear made from a whale bone lying on the ground and forcefully thrust it into the wolf's rear end. A muffled thud echoed as the spear penetrated the wolf's anus but stopped after half an inch. Lu Zhenhan's strength had dwindled to the point of feebleness. The giant wolf let out a howl that was both chilling and mournful, shaking the earth. In the nearby thicket, a flock of seabirds resembling partridges fluttered in alarm. The wolf struggled to stand but slipped again, failing to rise. Listening to the wolf's wheezing breaths, Lu Zhenhan grew increasingly anxious. Trembling, he reached out to pull out the spear lodged in the wolf's anus. However, despite 2 attempts, his hand slipped, and he couldn't budge it. Completely drained, Lu Zhenhan felt that even if he managed to remove the spear, he doubted he would have the strength to deliver another blow. Both the wolf and Lu Zhenhan were gasping for breath. Lu Zhenhan's chest rose and fell dramatically as he lay on his back, while the wolf's belly trembled like a drum against the ground. Ultimately, it was the wolf that managed to struggle to its feet first. Its forelegs wobbled momentarily, but it managed to remain standing, albeit slowly and clumsily. It turned in place, leaving imprints with its paws on the ground. While the spear lodged in its rear end vanished from Lu Zhenhan's line of sight, Lu Zhenhan propped himself up halfway, looking defiantly at the wolf without showing any signs of weakness. At this point, the earlier tension and fear had completely vanished. Lu Zhenhan believed that if he hadn't been injured and weakened by excessive blood loss, there would be no reason for him not to overcome the wolf. But the realization left him feeling frustrated. One of the wolf's eyes, previously hit by a burst of air, now resembled an empty socket, containing a shattered glass-like eyeball with radial cracks. However, there was no blood oozing from its eye socket. Instead, it was covered in a frozen red glass-like substance that filled the entire socket. The gigantic wolf slowly moved its body step by step, inching closer to the mound. Its claws grasped the hillside, attempting to stand upright. With its sharp claws, it scraped off patches of moss from the mound, causing them to slide down repeatedly. Each time the wolf extended its claws, it scratched the grayish stone chips from the underlying rocky terrain, and every breath it took expelled a white foam with a strong foul odor, splattering onto the mound. Lu Zhenhan witnessed the foam and knew that success was within reach. He exerted even more force, feeling as though he had used every ounce of strength he had ever possessed, just as they were on the verge of strangling the giant wolf. The vine unexpectedly snapped with a crack. Both Lu Zhenhan and Guogua tumbled away from the mound. Lu Zhenhan narrowly avoided plunging his head into the bonfire, but a singed smell filled the air, and his hair had been partially scorched. Guogua collided into his arms, and he grabbed her by the long ears. Even before extinguishing the flames on her hair, she quickly executed a graceful carp leaping maneuver, picking up the half-whale bone spear on the ground. With determination, she fiercely thrust it into the wolf's anus. A muffled thud echoed as the spear stopped half an inch inside the wolf's rectum. Lu Zhenhan's strength had waned considerably. The wolf emitted a piercing and mournful howl, lifting its head high, restrained by the tree vine. It struggled to stand but slipped back down. Never managing to regain its footing, Lu Zhenhan, listening to its wheezing breaths resembling a bellows, grew increasingly nervous. Trembling, he attempted to reach over and remove the whalebone spear lodged in the wolf's anus. However, his hands slipped twice during the attempt, and he couldn't budge it. Lu Zhenhan was utterly depleted. Even if he managed to extract the spear, he doubted he would have the strength to strike again. Both the wolf and Lu Zhenhan gasped for breath. Lu Zhenhan lay on his back, his chest rising and falling violently, while the wolf's belly quivered like a drum against the ground. Eventually, the wolf managed to struggle to its feet, albeit unsteadily. It stumbled for a moment but managed to remain standing, slowly and sluggishly turning in a circle. The whalebone spear, embedded in its posterior, disappeared from Lu Zhenhan's line of sight. Lu Zhenhan propped himself up, half of his body supported by sheer willpower. He stared at the wolf, unyielding, despite the situation. At this stage, any previous tension and fear had vanished entirely. Lu Zhenhan believed that if he hadn't been weakened by injury and excessive bleeding, there would be no reason he couldn't finish off the wolf. The thought left him feeling frustrated. The wolf's other eye glared with a vengeful gaze. While Lu Zhenhan gasped for air and cursed, "Damn you! Who the hell allowed you to mess with me?" "Serves you right." The wolf's front legs gave way, and it half knelt on the ground. The man and the wolf locked their gazes, both breathing heavily. "Oh, shit!" Lu Zhenhan felt a weight lift off his shoulders and secretly rejoiced. "It looks like it doesn't have the strength to bite me to death." The wolf's facial expression twitched, appearing to mock Lu Zhenhan's ignorance. This peculiar smile startled Lu Zhenhan. Can wolves even smile? What a joke! Lu Zhenhan struggled to stand, but the wolf's smile made him sense a strong sense of conspiracy and cunning. It was the smile of a victor, the pride a general displayed when looking at a captive. The wolf's massive maw opened again. Covered in a thick layer of ice and snow, even its fangs were encrusted with ice shards. A barely perceptible whirlwind of air condensed within its mouth, resembling a miniature tornado, rapidly growing and gathering strength. It was then that Lu Zhenhan remembered that the wolf had another trick up its sleeve. A chill ran down his spine, chilling him from head to toe. The wolf didn't need its fangs and claws. With this sharp and blade-like wind, it could slice him in half just like a machete through the jungle. Lu Zhenhan's eyes welled up with tears. He thought of his sister, his mother, and his brother. He realized he was far too attached to this world. The wind within the wolf's mouth continued to gather, and its gaze reminded Lu Zhenhan of the gleaming sickle held by a farmer during the autumn harvest. Suddenly, Guogua broke free from Lu Zhenhan's grip. She plopped down onto the ground, her plump belly sticking out as she let out a deep breath. A white sphere emerged from her mouth with a swift whoosh, shooting directly into the wide-open jaws of the giant wolf. A feeling of fear spread through the wolf's remaining eye. The sphere of air collided with the gathering wind blade, resulting in a piercing sound reminiscent of ripping silk. The wolf's mouth was sliced open from its upper palate to its nasal bridge, leaving behind a massive gash. There was no blood or agonizing cry. The wolf's face instantly turned a ghastly white, and with a thud like a wooden stake, it collapsed to the ground. Guogua let out a string of gurgling sounds from her throat and plopped down on the ground. Her large ears, which were previously standing upright, drooped as if she had exerted too much effort. Lu Zhenhan's mouth hung open in an exaggerated manner, as if it could fit a coconut inside. He pointed at Gwugwa, his finger trembling vigorously. He couldn't believe his eyes. Sweat beads rolled down Gwugwa's little nose, staining her entire face with mud and dirt from the ground. Amidst his astonishment, Lu Zhenhan felt a pang of heartache. Turning around, Gwugwa wore a stunned expression. With shaky little paws, she pointed at Lu Zhenhan's crotch. Gwugwa then glanced down at her own lower body, highlighting the stark difference between them, like a small blade of grass compared to a towering tree. "Oh, for goodness sake." Lu Zhenhan quickly grabbed the homemade underwear and hastily covered his sensitive area. Even though it was just being pointed at by Gwugwa, he couldn't help but feel extremely uncomfortable. "You little rascal." Lu Zhenhan covered his groin with one hand while pinching Gwugwa's rosy little face with the other. "I never expected you to have this move, you little thing. How did you learn it?" "Freezing such a huge wolf, that's impressive." Gwugwa let out a contented whimper. Squirming her little face in Lu Zhenhan's palm and nuzzling his hand with her fluffy little head. Lu Zhenhan realized he was quite fortunate. His legs felt weak again, and he plopped back down on the ground, taking a rest. After a while, he stood up and looked at the frozen corpse of the giant wolf. He even touched its body. It was stiff and cold, as if it had just been pulled out of a refrigerator. Luckily, the coconut gourd with the bird eggs was still intact and hadn't been knocked over. Lu Zhenhan quickly retrieved a few more eggs and threw them into the bonfire. At this point, he desperately needed the nourishment to replenish his energy. Holding Gwugwa in his arms, Lu Zhenhan tossed and turned, pondering where exactly they were and why there would be such a giant wolf capable of spewing wind blades. Why would even a small creature like Gwugwa be able to exhale icy gusts? The more he thought about it, the more confused he became. He couldn't make sense of it all. Lu Zhenhan decided to stop thinking about it altogether. The scent of the roasted bird eggs far surpassed these mysteries. He would wait for the moon to rise, observe the stars in the sky, and then determine their direction. That's what Lu Zhenhan thought to himself. After finishing the bird eggs, a thoroughly exhausted Lu Zhenhan couldn't hold on any longer. He collapsed onto the thatched bed next to the bonfire and fell asleep. Whether or not another giant wolf would come looking for trouble, he couldn't care less at this point. Eventually, it would come, and whoever it was, well, let them come. In the middle of the night, he was awakened by the cold. The bonfire had dwindled to a cluster of sparks, and the firewood was nearly burned out. Cold winds swept whoosh over the earth and mound. Despite the bed being sheltered from the wind at the foot of the hill, it was still freezing. Lu Zhenhan glanced at Gwugwa, who was curled up in his arms, and lovingly patted her little head. The small creature's big ears twitched. She smacked her lips, rolled over, and exposed her round belly. In the middle of the night, he was awakened by the cold. The bonfire had dwindled to a cluster of sparks, and the firewood was nearly burned out. Cold winds swept whoosh over the earth and mound. Despite the bed being sheltered from the wind at the foot of the hill, it was still freezing. Lu Zhenhan glanced at Gwugwa, who was curled up in his arms, and lovingly patted her little head. The small creature's big ears twitched. She smacked her lips, rolled over, and exposed her round belly. Lu Zhenhan grabbed the sock and covered the exposed belly of the little creature. He gently stroked its head. Under the chilly starlight, the blood-stained sock and Gwugwa's shiny golden fur inexplicably tugged at Lu Zhenhan's heart, quietly getting up. He went to the nearby thatched grass and collected some twigs and dry thorns. He returned and rekindled the bonfire. What a cursed place. How nice it would be to have a cigarette. Lu Zhenhan sat in front of the fire, feeling a tinge of nostalgia. Regardless of what happened tomorrow, his first priority would be to find some salt and build a rudimentary shelter. Without salt, he felt as if his head was heavy and his steps were light, in a dazed and sluggish state. The stars in the distant sky blinked silently at him. Lu Zhenhan squinted his eyes and searched but couldn't find a familiar constellation, let alone the position of the North Star. A mass of dark clouds dispersed, revealing the moon's face. The cold moonlight illuminated Lu Zhenhan, who stared at it in disbelief. He shook his head. Was this the moon? It was enormous and imposing, with clearly visible volcanic craters on its surface. This moon was way too big. If the moons he had seen before were the size of mooncakes, then the one he saw today was akin to a giant cooking pot used by an army. Is this still the world I once inhabited? Lu Zhenhan, filled with countless doubts, slipped back into slumber in his hazy state. When the first rays of sunlight fell upon Lu Zhenhan, Guogua woke up first in his embrace. The little creature opened her bleary eyes and used her tiny paws to push away the blanket, or rather, the sock, that covered her. She gleefully licked Lu Zhenhan's earlobe with her tongue. Old Lu was in the midst of a hazy daydream and, with this lick, a certain part of his lower body swelled up like a Mongolian yurt. Damn it! Lu Zhenhan immediately sat up, panting heavily. Guogua let out a joyful shriek and, with a few hops, climbed onto Lu Zhenhan's head. Lu Zhenhan stretched his body with a big yawn, flexed his muscles, and felt his strength returning. However, his nose was even more painful than the day before. He touched it with his hand and was relieved to find that it had scabbed over. This discovery dispelled Lu Zhenhan's fear of bleeding to death. After covering the fire pit with ash, Lu Zhenhan tried a set of military-style punches. He felt that his skills had recovered quite well. Satisfied, he nodded his head. Little Guogua, seeing him throwing punches and kicks with great vigor, jumped down from his head and imitated Lu Zhenhan, curving its hind legs and playfully mimicking his moves. Lu Zhenhan burst into laughter, finding this little creature incredibly amusing. Let's go, baby. Lu Zhenhan scooped up Guogua, who was still practicing the Black Tiger Strikes Heart technique. We'll go and get some daily necessities. He touched the wolf carcass, with yesterday's whalebone spear still stuck in its rear end. After a night had passed, the wolf carcass was still cold, but noticeably less stiff than before. Lu Zhenhan pulled out the spear from the wolf's fur and wiped it clean on the coarse grass. As a scout, he preferred using short-range weapons. He had modified this whalebone spear and had been studying it for quite some time. Satisfied with the results, Lu Zhenhan smiled and picked up a sturdy wooden stick from the shrubs. He took a moment to examine his appearance, resembling a cave-dwelling ape on the mountaintop, and couldn't help but laugh. Lu Zhenhan set up a temporary shelter, carefully surveying the dense red willow forest beyond the earthen mound. This forest was larger than the one he had passed by yesterday, and amidst the undulating hills and valleys of the island, it was one of the more prominent features, apart from a few distant mounds. Before setting off, Lu Zhenhan had climbed up one of the mounds to take a look. The route he had taken was just a corner of the small island, and he had chosen a good spot to set up camp. The front and right were covered in shrubs, while the rear was protected by the mound, blocking the foul sea breeze. On the other end of the red willow forest, there was a beach. Although partially obscured by the red willow trees, it appeared larger than the beach Lu Zhenhan had woken up on yesterday. The beach he had awakened on yesterday and this one were separated by a single mountain, with a massive rock formation in between. That was Lu Zhenhan's destination for the day. As he passed through the red willow forest, Lu Zhenhan decided not to collect any more bird eggs. He was already carrying 2 coconuts, and didn't want to trouble himself further. After all, the island was like a pantry where he could pick and eat as he pleased. Lu Zhenhan whistled triumphantly, greeting the seabirds nervously circling in the sky. It took Lu Zhenhan about half an hour to traverse the red willow forest before finally emerging from it. To ensure he wouldn't get lost on the way back, he carved a large X on the tree bark at every interval using the whalebone spear. This action consumed a considerable amount of his precious time. This beach was indeed larger than the one from yesterday. There were more palm trees and coconut trees scattered around. In the nearby sea, jagged reefs occasionally emerged and disappeared. And the lonely sound of the waves crashing against the rocks was perhaps the only sound to be heard. Lu Zhenhan's feet, covered in bird droppings, were likely the first human footsteps on this beach. The sand was littered with sun-dried animal dung and shells left behind by the receding tide. After tossing away the big wooden stick, Lu Zhenhan grabbed Guogua by the big ears and placed him on the beach. With the whalebone spike held in his mouth, he dived into the seawater. He didn't dare to go too far into the distance, as who knows what whirlpools and peculiar sea creatures lurked there. If another creature like yesterday's wolf emerged, spewing wind blades and snow arrows, he wouldn't be able to handle it, swimming between several coral reefs. Lu Zhenhan found what he was looking for, a giant clam. The dark clamshell was covered with seaweed and kelp, firmly attached to the coral reef. Its diameter was as wide as a wide-brimmed hat. Using the whalebone spike in his hand, Lu Zhenhan pried the clam off the reef. He swam back while holding the clamshell, and as soon as he reached the surface, he felt the weight in his hand. Lu Zhenhan estimated that it weighed about 20 to 30 pounds. Guogua was anxiously running on the shore, calling out, "Guogua." As soon as Guogua saw Lu Zhenhan's head above the water, he screamed and jumped onto his head, grabbing onto his hair tightly. Lu Zhenhan held the clam and used his free hand to pat Guogua's head. Impatient, aren't you, setting down the prey, Lu Zhenhan took the whalebone and tried to pry open the clamshell. After struggling for a while, he couldn't manage to insert it. Lu Zhenhan thought for a moment, turned the clam upside down, and poured some pebbles into the crack. The clamshell slightly opened, spurting out a stream of water. Lu Zhenhan took the opportunity to pry open the shell with both hands, straining with all his might. The clamshell made a crunchy sound. And with Lu Zhenhan's tremendous strength, it finally gave way. The yellowish clam meat shimmered brightly under the sunlight. Lu Zhenhan quickly cleaned out the clam meat in a few moves and even found a few irregular-shaped pearls inside. He rinsed the large clamshell and its beautiful patterns became visible, resembling concentric circles. Lu Zhenhan was ecstatic that he found a few rocks and roughly built 2 stoves. Lu Zhenhan then went back to the red willow forest and collected over a dozen bird eggs. He used friction to start a fire and used the clamshell as a large pot to cook coconut milk poached eggs in one and seawater in the other. Guogua sniffed the delicious aroma coming from the clamshell pot, his little nose twitching. He obediently sat on the side, wagging his tail, eagerly waiting to eat. This little creature was probably only well-behaved when it came to eating. Lu Zhenhan, the culinary master, strikes again. Lu Zhenhan boasted, taking a bite. Besides a slight lingering taste of the clam, the flavor was indeed excellent. When Lu Zhenhan arrives, eggshells scatter. The big man grew even more proud, even raising his thumbs. Lu Zhenhan grabbed the sock and covered the exposed belly of the little creature. He gently stroked its head. Under the chilly starlight, the blood-stained sock and Guoguo's shiny golden fur inexplicably tugged at Lu Zhenhan's heart, quietly getting up. He went to the nearby thatched grass and collected some twigs and dry thorns. He returned and rekindled the bonfire. What a cursed place! How nice it would be to have a cigarette. Lu Zhenhan sat in front of the fire, feeling a tinge of nostalgia. Regardless of what happened tomorrow, his first priority would be to find some salt and build a rudimentary shelter. Without salt, he felt as if his head was heavy and his steps were light. In a dazed and sluggish state, the stars in the distant sky blinked silently at him. Lu Zhenhan squinted his eyes and searched but couldn't find a familiar constellation, let alone the position of the North Star. A mass of dark clouds dispersed, revealing the moon's face. The cold moonlight illuminated Lu Zhenhan, who stared at it in disbelief. He shook his head. Was this the moon? It was enormous and imposing, with clearly visible volcanic craters on its surface. This moon was way too big. If the moons he had seen before were the size of mooncakes, then the one he saw today was akin to a giant cooking pot used by an army. Is this still the world I once inhabited? Lu Zhenhan, filled with countless doubts, slipped back into slumber in his hazy state. When the first rays of sunlight fell upon Lu Zhenhan, Guoguo woke up first in his embrace. The little creature opened her bleary eyes and used her tiny paws to push away the blanket, or rather, the sock, that covered her. She gleefully licked Lu Zhenhan's earlobe with her tongue. Old Lu was in the midst of a hazy daydream and, with this lick, a certain part of his lower body swelled up like a Mongolian yurt. Damn it! Lu Zhenhan immediately sat up, panting heavily. Guoguo let out a joyful shriek and, with a few hops, climbed onto Lu Zhenhan's head. Lu Zhenhan stretched his body with a big yawn, flexed his muscles, and felt his strength returning. However, his nose was even more painful than the day before. He touched it with his hand and was relieved to find that it had scabbed over. This discovery dispelled Lu Zhenhan's fear of bleeding to death.